The Grand Assembly Hall of the Interstellar Council was one of the most impressive structures ever built by any civilization in the known galaxy. It floated in a slow orbit around the neutral moon of Verath Prime, its outer shell made from a crystal alloy that caught starlight and held it like a cupped hand holds water. Inside, the hall was massive, wide enough to seat the delegates of 42 civilizations, each seated behind their species banner, each breathing their own filtered air through personal atmospheric modules. It was a place built to look like peace. It was a place where, on this particular day, peace was not what was being decided. Nathan Cole stood at the center podium and looked out at the rows of alien faces. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with short gray hair and dark eyes that had seen a great many things and had learned, over many decades, to give very little away. He had been Earth's senior diplomatic envoy for 11 years. Before that, he had been a Navy officer. Before that, a young man from a small town in Colorado who had looked up at the stars and thought, one day, he would find out what was up there. Now he stood in the heart of the galaxy's most powerful governing body, and he was being told to leave. The vote had been called 3 days earlier. The charges, if you could call them that, had been read aloud by the council's chief secretary, a thin-limbed Vorath bureaucrat with pale violet skin and 4 small eyes that never blinked. The charges were not about war crimes. They were not about territorial violations or broken treaties. They were stranger than that, and in some ways, more insulting. Humanity was deemed biologically irrational, too emotional, too unpredictable, prone to forming attachments with species they had no business forming attachments with, prone to creative problem-solving in situations that did not call for it, prone to what the Vorath representative had described in a tone that made it sound like a disease as excessive resilience. In short, the Council was afraid of something it could not control, and since it could not control humanity, it had decided to remove humanity instead. The voting screen above the hall displayed the numbers in cold blue light. 38 in favor of expulsion, 4 against. Nathan read the numbers once and did not read them again. The hall was very quiet. Every delegate was watching him. Some of them leaned forward. The Vorath ambassador, Keth Vala, sat in the front row of the senior delegates' gallery, his long fingers pressed together, his 4 pale eyes fixed on Nathan with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been something else. Keth Vala had worked toward this vote for over 6 years. He was a careful, intelligent creature who understood politics the way a surgeon understood bone. Precisely, methodically, without sentiment. He had expected Nathan to argue. He had prepared responses to every possible argument. He had even, privately, hoped for a little anger. Anger he knew how to handle. Nathan picked up his datapad from the podium surface. He tucked it under his arm. He looked out at the hall one more time, at the 42 species watching him from behind their banners, at the crystal walls catching starlight, at the vote still glowing on the screen above him. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has understood something that does not surprise him. Understood, he said, into the podium's open microphone. His voice was calm and even. We'll show ourselves out. That was all. He turned and walked toward the exit. The murmur that moved through the hall was not the murmur of relief. It was the murmur of confusion, the particular sound a crowd makes when something happens that does not fit the shape of what they expected. Delegates turned to each other. Translators whispered into earpieces. The Vorath Secretary General checked his notes, as if perhaps he had missed a step in the procedure. Keth Vala did not move. He sat very still and watched Nathan Cole walk away, and somewhere inside his chest, in the organ that functioned, in Vorath biology, as a rough equivalent of a stomach, he felt something shift. It was small. It was cold. He did not have a name for it yet. He would think about it for many days afterward, and still not find the right word in any language he knew. He had expected a fight. He had prepared for a fight. The absence of a fight was, in a way he could not fully explain even to himself, far more unsettling than any fight would have been. On the far side of the hall, near the eastern exit, Nathan's colleague Dr. C. Dana Okafor fell into step beside him. She was a small woman with close-cropped natural hair and round glasses she wore out of habit rather than necessity. Her vision had been corrected years ago, but she liked the weight of the frames on her nose. She was Earth's chief science advisor to the Council, and had spent 4 years on Verath Prime studying alien biosystems. She had made friends with 3 species that the Council considered too minor to be worth diplomatic attention, learned 2 alien languages for fun, and once spent a weekend helping a Marathi custodial worker repair a water recycling unit on sub-level 9, simply because she noticed it was broken, and it seemed like the right thing to do. Dana said nothing as they walked, but there was a small smile on her face. Not a smug smile, not a mean smile, the kind of smile that lives just at the edge of a private thought. The kind of smile that knows something. 3 Drellin delegates passed them in the corridor, and watched the 2 humans go by. One of the Drellins, a senior cultural observer named Orath Kess, who had spent 20 years studying human behavioral patterns, turned to his colleague and said quietly, in Drellin, "Did you notice? No anger, no threats. Not even a raised voice." His colleague said, "Maybe they accepted it." Orath Kess watched the corridor where the humans had disappeared. "No," he said slowly, "they did not accept it. That is not what that was." He paused. "I have studied humans for a very long time. When a human is truly beaten, they look beaten. When a human raises no voice, shows no anger, smiles like that," he stopped. "That is not surrender. I don't know what it is, but it is not surrender." Back in the hall, Kethvala finally stood. The vote was done. The expulsion was official. Earth's membership in the Interstellar Council was over. He should have felt the clean satisfaction of a plan completed. He had worked for 6 years for this outcome. Instead, he stood in the middle of the galaxy's most powerful chamber and tried, unsuccessfully, to shake the feeling that he had not just won something. He had started something. And he had no idea where it was going to end. The formal withdrawal took 6 months. That was how long it took for every human diplomat, engineer, scientist, researcher, and contractor to pack their things, close their offices, hand over their access cards, and leave every joint council project they had ever been a part of. It was a long time, and also, somehow, a very short time, because the humans did not drag it out. They did not stall. They did not make it difficult. They simply began on the morning after the vote, and they worked through it with the same quiet efficiency they brought to most things. Admiral Laura Voss oversaw the military withdrawal from Earth's Deep Space Fleet Command Center near the outer corridor. She was a lean woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair, and the particular kind of stillness that came from spending 20 years commanding ships in places where being calm was not a preference, but a survival requirement. She rerouted Earth's patrol vessels, recalled joint crew members from Council ships, and closed every shared navigation agreement without a single incident. Her officers noted that she chose unusual paths for the returning vessels, not the fastest routes, but routes that moved through the outer territories, past the border systems, along the edges of deep space. When one of her lieutenants asked about the route choices, she said only, "I like the view out here. Keep moving." None of her officers pushed the question further. They had worked with her long enough to know that when Admiral Voss said something that sounded simple, it was almost always more than simple. On the Council's joint research station near the Drell system, a man named Owen Briggs spent his final 2 weeks doing what Owen Briggs always did, making sure everything worked before he left. Owen was 39 years old, originally from a small town in Oregon, and had the calm and slightly rumpled look of a person who had spent most of his adult life in maintenance bays and server rooms. He was lead infrastructure engineer on 3 of the Council's most important relay network projects. He had held those roles for 7 years. In that time, He had quietly fixed more broken systems than anyone had ever formally documented. Because Owen had never been the sort of person who fixed things in order to get credit. He fixed things because they were broken, and he was there. In his last week on the station, Owen walked through every system his team had built or maintained. He checked coolant pressure readings, recalibrated signal arrays, replaced 2 components that were wearing thin and would have failed within months, and updated the maintenance logs with notes so detailed that any competent engineer, human or otherwise, should have been able to follow them. On his last relay panel, in the lowest maintenance corridor of Substation 7, he left a small sticky note, written in standard script. It read, "She runs best at 72% coolant pressure. You're welcome." Then Owen Briggs picked up his tool bag, said goodbye to the 3 alien co-workers he had genuinely liked, and boarded the transport home. 3 months later, 4 of the Council's major infrastructure projects stalled. The relay network in the outer corridor began losing signal integrity. 2 atmospheric processors on a joint Council habitat started running irregular cycles. A deep space communications array that served 9 Council member worlds went dark for 31 hours. The Vorath Technical Committee convened an emergency session and called in every engineer they had. What they found was not sabotage. It was not malicious damage. It was something quieter, and in many ways more alarming. The humans had not broken anything on their way out. They had simply stopped holding it together. Systems that had been running smoothly for years turned out to have been running smoothly because someone, usually a human engineer or contractor, often without being asked, and rarely with any formal documentation, had been quietly patching, adjusting, compensating, and maintaining them all along. The relay network that Owen's team had built was the clearest example. It functioned on an improvised architecture that Owen had developed over 4 years, solving problems as they arose, layering solutions on top of each other the way a person layers repairs on an old but well-loved machine. It worked brilliantly. It also existed almost entirely inside Owen Briggs's head, with the exception of the maintenance notes he had left behind, which the Vorath engineers initially dismissed as too simple to be useful. It took them 2 weeks of failures before one junior technician finally followed Owen's notes exactly and got the system running again. The junior technician's report, filed quietly and then quickly classified, noted that the repair had worked not because the system was complex, but because the human who built it had understood it in a way that was difficult to teach. He did not build it the way the manual says to build it, the report said. He built it the way it needed to be built in order to actually work. Meanwhile, on Earth, there was remarkably little anger. This was, to the aliens monitoring human news feeds, one of the most confusing parts of the whole situation. The expulsion had been covered heavily for about a week. News programs ran long segments, analysts gave their opinions, a few politicians made speeches about dignity and sovereignty. And then, slowly, the news cycle moved on. There were no protests outside government buildings. There was no mass demonstration of outrage. A late-night television host named Amy Keller gave a monologue about it that ran for 4 minutes and became, quietly, one of the most widely watched pieces of human media to circulate through alien information networks in the following year. Amy stood at her desk in front of her studio audience, shrugged one shoulder, and said, "So, they kicked us out. Okay. We've been kicked out of better places than that. Remember high school? Every single one of us got left out of something in high school. And every single one of us went home, cried about it maybe a little, and then went and built something better. That's it. That's the whole human story. We get left out, and then we build something better." The audience laughed and clapped. It was a late-night comedy show. It was not supposed to be a significant cultural moment. The clip reached Keth Vala's private terminal on Vorath Prime 17 days later, forwarded by one of his intelligence analysts with a short note that read, "You should watch this." He watched it once. Then he watched it again. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his office for a very long time. He had studied humanity for 6 years while building his case for the expulsion. He had read reports, reviewed behavioral studies, attended briefings. He had believed he understood them. Sitting in his office on the night he watched Amy Keller shrug on a television stage, he began to understand that he had understood almost nothing at all. They were not grieving. They were not even particularly upset. They were already looking forward. They were already thinking about what came next. And the thing that kept Kethvala staring at his ceiling long after his office lights had dimmed was a question he could not answer. What exactly did they think came next? A year passed. Humanity did not collapse. This had been, privately, the assumption that many council members had never said out loud, but had quietly believed. That without the structure of the council's trade agreements, without access to shared resources and protected space lanes, without the legal and diplomatic frameworks that had governed interstellar civilization for 2 centuries, Earth would struggle. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually, they thought, the humans would feel the pressure of isolation. They would come back. Maybe not begging, even the Vorath analysts had not expected that, but asking, at least, requesting re-entry talks, making the first move. The first move never came. What came instead was something that nobody had planned for, because nobody had thought to plan for it. A bilateral trade agreement between Earth and the Drell Compact, a loose grouping of 6 small worlds that the Council had always treated as a minor trading zone. Too disorganized to be worth serious diplomatic attention, too economically limited to be a useful partner. The Drell Compact, for its part, had spent decades trying to get the Council to approve favorable trade terms, and had been politely ignored at every session. Within 3 months of Earth's expulsion, humanity and the Drell Compact had signed a mutual resource exchange agreement that gave both sides exactly what they needed, with no Council oversight required. Then came an agreement with the Marathi nomads, a traveling fleet civilization that moved through the outer sectors on ancient migration routes, trading biological samples and rare atmospheric compounds for manufactured goods. The Council had never signed anything with the Marathi, and the Council's legal framework required one. Humanity simply made a different kind of agreement, one without fixed address requirements. And the Marathi nomads were, within 4 months, Earth's most enthusiastic new trading partners. Then the gas miner clans of the Outer Belt, 3 independent species who had been in a slow, grinding territorial dispute for 40 years. Earth sent 2 people to mediate. Not diplomats, a retired city planning administrator named Gerald Park, and a logistics coordinator named Becca Sutton, who had spent 15 years managing shipping schedules for a deep space cargo company. They had no political training. They had no formal mandate. What they had was patience, a whiteboard, and the peculiar human habit of treating every problem as, at its core, a scheduling problem. The mediation took 3 weeks. The gas miner clans signed a shared territory agreement that has held without incident ever since. These deals were not grand. They were not the kind of sweeping alliances that reshaped galactic politics in a single day. But a Vorath intelligence analyst named Seveth Ron, who had been assigned the task of monitoring Earth post-expulsion activity, began to see a pattern that she found deeply uncomfortable. Seveth Ron was young for an analyst, barely 40 years into her career, which made her something of a junior voice in the Vorath intelligence community. She was careful and precise, the kind of thinker who distrusted large conclusions and always wanted more data before she spoke. But the data she was accumulating pointed in a direction that she could not ignore. She mapped every bilateral agreement Earth had signed in 12 months on a holographic display in her office, and stepped back and looked at it. The connections spread outward from Earth, like roots under a field. Quiet, invisible on the surface, but branching continuously, linking to other roots, building a network underground while nothing appeared to be happening above. She wrote an internal report. She titled it simply, Earth, 12 months post-expulsion, and sent it up through the chain to her section chief. Within 6 hours it had been classified. Within 2 days, it had reached Kethvala's desk. Her central conclusion was plain. Humanity does not require formal institutions in order to organize. They build trust the way other species build walls, naturally, instinctively, and without needing anyone to instruct them to do it. The network they are currently building is not a replacement for the Council. It is something else. We do not have a category for what it is. Kethvala read the report twice, and then called a restricted emergency session of the Vorath Consensus's Senior Advisory Board. He did not tell them what to think about findings, and then asked the room for responses. There were none for almost 2 full minutes, which was unusual. The Vorath Advisory Board was not known for its silence. What had happened with Connor Marsh did not help matters. Connor was 28 years old and had been part of a joint xenobiology survey team working in the outer reaches of the Marathi migration corridor. A project he had arranged himself, writing personally to the Marathi Elder Council with a research proposal that was 2 pages long and described entirely in terms the Marathi found practical and respectful. He had done his homework. He had learned enough of the Marathi's trade dialect to write the proposal in their language. He had also, because he was that kind of person, included a section on how the research would benefit the Marathi's understanding of their own migration routes, not just Earth's scientific interests. The Marathi had agreed. Connor had gone. He and a Marathi scientist named Vert Alan had been mapping atmospheric sample sites along the corridor's second arc, when their survey vessel hit an uncharted debris field. The impact was survivable, but it cracked a secondary hull section and knocked out 2 environmental systems. Vert Alan took a bad cut along his primary respiratory membrane. Connor spent 40 minutes in the broken cargo bay with a medical kit that had been damaged in the impact, a coil of synthetic tubing left over from an earlier repair job, and a pocket reference guide for Marathi biology that he had downloaded to his personal tablet before the mission because he believed in being prepared. He improvised a pressure sleeve from the tubing, used the undamaged part of the medical kit to seal the membrane tear, and kept Vertalan stable for the 6 hours it took their emergency beacon to bring a rescue ship. The Elder Council heard the full account, not just the medical part, but the language, the respectful proposal, the downloaded reference guide, the hours of calm work in a broken ship. They upgraded their bilateral agreement with Earth to a full mutual defense pact. No council involvement, no formal structure. One man with a roll of synthetic tubing and a habit of being prepared. And Earth now had its first mutual defense alliance with a non-council civilization. When Kethvala added this to the holographic map, alongside Seveth Ron's network analysis, the result was something that sat in the room like a cold wind. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to the eldest member of the Vorath Advisory Board, a gray carapaced veteran named Thos Moran, who had been in governance for over a century, and asked what he thought. Thos Moran looked at the map. He looked at the routes spreading outward from that single blue point that represented Earth. He looked at how many of those routes had thickened in 12 months. Then he said, slowly, "We removed them because they were unpredictable, and we could not control them. We thought removal would contain them. But you cannot contain something by giving it more space to grow. All we have done is removed the only limits they had." No one in the room had an answer to that. The meeting ended without conclusions, without a plan, and without the clean sense of resolution that Vorath advisory sessions were supposed to produce. Kethvala walked home through the lamplit streets of Vorath Prime's capital city that night. And for the first time in 6 years, he was not thinking about strategy. He was thinking about a human woman smiling at an exit door. He was thinking about a man who fixed relay systems and left sticky notes. He was thinking about a 28-year-old xenobiologist who downloaded reference guides before every mission just in case. He was thinking about what kind of species does all of that, quietly, without being told, without needing a reason beyond the simple fact that it seemed like the right thing to do. He thought about it all the way home. He did not sleep well that night. Freeport Station did not look like something that was supposed to change the galaxy. It had been constructed over 14 months, in a stretch of open space between the Outer Belt and the Marathi Migration Corridor, at a point where 3 independent trade routes crossed, without any council oversight. The structure itself was practical rather than beautiful. Wide central rings connected by pressurized walkways, modular docking arms that could be adjusted for ships of almost any configuration. Atmospheric zones divided by transparent barriers so that species with different breathing needs could share a market floor without requiring individual suits. It smelled of machinery and food and recycled air, and the particular sharp scent that several species gave off when they were doing business. It was also, within 8 months of opening, the busiest independent hub in the known galaxy. The Council's trade monitors noted the traffic numbers and reported them upward. The reports used neutral language, the kind of language designed to describe facts without implying conclusions. But the facts themselves were not neutral. Ships that had previously traveled long routes through Council-controlled space lanes were diverting to Freeport, because Freeport had no docking restrictions based on species affiliation, no membership requirements, and no tariffs beyond a flat maintenance fee that went directly to station upkeep. The Drell compact traders were there. The Marathi nomads had established a semi-permanent berth on the outer docking ring. The gas miner clans of the Outer Belt, who had been in a territorial dispute 40 years before humanity showed up with a whiteboard and fixed it, now ran 3 of the station's most productive supply depots, side by side, without significant incident. At the center of the station's social structure, insofar as it had one, which was a loose and lively thing, rather than a formal institution, was a retired judge from Ohio named Carl Deming. Carl was 61 years old, white-haired, with a wide face that was easy to read, and a voice that was very hard to rush. He had spent 30 years resolving labor disputes at a manufacturing plant, and had eventually become a county circuit judge, a role he had held for 11 years before retiring and, in his own words, getting bored. When he heard about Freeport, he wrote a message to the station's administrative coordinator, a young woman named Priya Webb, who was managing the entire operation from a converted storage room with 2 assistants and a coffee machine, and offered to set up a mediation office. Priya wrote back the same day, "When can you start?" Carl's mediation system was not a legal system in any formal sense. It had no binding authority over anyone. What it had was a table, 2 chairs, a habit of starting every session by offering the parties something to drink, and Carl himself, a man who had spent decades listening to people argue and had developed, somewhere in all those years, an almost preternatural ability to find the thing underneath the argument that was actually making both sides afraid. He had resolved 47 interspecies disputes in 8 months, not because of any diplomatic training, not because of political leverage or legal frameworks, because he sat across from beings who had never shared a table with each other before, and he made them feel, through some combination of patience and plain honesty, that sharing the table was worth their time. The food stall run by Lisa Tran was another matter entirely. Lisa was 44, originally from Houston, and had retired from the Marine Corps after 18 years with the comfortable confidence of someone who had already done the hardest things she expected life to ask of her. She had opened the stall because she liked cooking and needed something to do. The menu was a rotating selection of human dishes, alongside whatever ingredients Marathi or Drell traders had brought in that week, combined in combinations that Lisa invented on the spot, and served with the cheerful authority of someone who had never doubted that people would like what she made. They did. Lines formed within the first week. Within a month, Lisa's stall had become, without anyone planning it, a place where disputes de-escalated because the parties involved were standing in a queue together, and the smell of whatever Lisa was cooking made it difficult to maintain full hostility. 3 separate interspecies conflicts had been informally resolved, in whole or in part, while waiting for food. One ongoing Drell-Outer Belt boundary argument had been completely settled during a shared meal. The two lead negotiators discovering, over a bowl of Lisa's improvised grain stew, that they had identical grievances about the council's mapping committee, and that common ground was, once found, a very workable foundation for everything else. It was into this station that Kethvala walked, in disguise, on a cold morning, in the second year after Earth's expulsion. He had not told his staff. He had taken a private transport, registered under a false identity, and docked at the Eastern Ring under a name that would not appear in any Vorath intelligence record. He wore a neutral environmental suit, without species markings, and had covered the identifying bioluminescent patterns on his neck that would have made him recognizable to anyone who knew Vorath anatomy. He was, as best he could manage, invisible. He had come because he needed to see it, not through reports, not through data summaries or analyst briefings. He needed to see with his own 4 eyes what humanity had built in the empty space the council had never thought to care about. He walked the main concourse for an hour, and said nothing, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. There were beings here from 14 different civilizations that he could identify. They were moving around each other, past each other, with each other, buying, selling, arguing, laughing, pointing at things, asking questions, making deals at small tables, with no documentation beyond a handshake or whatever equivalent gesture their species used. A Drell merchant and a human dock worker were in a loud and heated exchange about a loading schedule, both of them gesturing emphatically, voices raised, and then, without transition, they were laughing. Not the polite, careful laughter of formal diplomacy. Real laughter, the kind that happens when something is genuinely funny. 2 minutes later, they were walking toward the supply corridor together. A child, a small human girl, maybe 7 years old, with untidy braids and a backpack shaped like a small animal, ran past Kethvala on the concourse, and stopped, turned, and looked up at him. She held it out to him. He stared at her. She said something in English that his translator rendered as, "You look like you need a snack." He did not take the fruit. He was too surprised. She shrugged in an eerily familiar way that reminded him of something he could not place, and ran off to catch up with a woman who was waiting for her near the food stalls. Kethvala stood on the concourse of Freeport Station, and felt, for the second time in 2 years, that cold and nameless shift in his chest. But this time, it was different. The first time, standing in the council hall watching Nathan Cole walk away, it had been unease, the first tremor of a mistake he could not yet name. This time, it was something heavier. Something that had weight to it. He understood now what Seveth Rond had meant when she said humanity was building something that the council had no category for. He understood it because he was standing inside it. And what he understood was this. The humans had not built an institution. They had not built a government or an alliance or a power structure. They had built a place where things worked because the people in it made them work. Not because they were told to, not because a framework required it, but because that was simply what people did when you gave them a table and a little space and didn't put too many walls around them. He returned to his ship before anyone recognized him. He sat in the pilot's seat for a long time without engaging the engines. Then he took out his personal terminal and opened the message drafting function. He stared at the blank page for a while. Then he started typing his resignation letter. He did not explain it. He did not cite the visit to Freeport. He said only that he believed he had misunderstood the situation, and that he was no longer the right person to manage the council's relationship with the current moment. He submitted it that evening to the Vorath Consensus's senior board and did not check for responses. Seveth Rond received the news through official channels the following morning. She read the notification. She pulled up her original classified report on her terminal, scrolled to the final paragraph, and added 3 sentences. She wrote, "We expelled them because they were unpredictable. We forgot that to them, unpredictability is not a flaw. It is the whole point." Then she saved the document, closed her terminal, and went to get breakfast. She had a lot of work ahead of her. Someone was going to have to figure out how to explain this situation to the rest of the council, and she was fairly certain it was going to end up being her. She found to her own surprise that she did not entirely mind. The council was not falling apart. That was the thing the Vorath analysts kept telling themselves during the 3rd year after Earth's expulsion, as if saying it often enough would make it feel more true. The council was not falling apart. It was, however, changing in ways that nobody had predicted, in directions that nobody had planned, and at a speed that nobody could comfortably explain. 12 member species had opened bilateral ties with Earth or with Freeport Station. Some of these were small practical agreements, resource sharing, navigation access, medical exchange. Some were not small at all. The HFY Federation, one of the Council's oldest and most respected members, had sent a quiet, private message to Earth's Secretary of Interstellar Affairs, asking about joining the Freeport network. The HFY had been in the Council for 200 years. They did not make quiet, private inquiries, unless they had thought very carefully about what they were doing. 3 other member species had done something even stranger. They had not approached Earth about joining anything. They had approached Earth about their own readmission, not Earth's readmission to the Council, but their own readmission to Earth's world, to the bilateral network, to Freeport, to whatever it was that humanity was building in the space the Council had never cared about. These were species that were already Council members who had voted to expel Earth, who were now, in effect, asking if they could please be included in the thing they had voted to exclude. Kethvala's resignation had created a political opening, and several factions inside the Vorath consensus had moved quickly to fill it, not with harder-line voices, but with more careful ones. Seveth Ron had been promoted twice in 18 months, which was unusual enough that her colleagues noticed and said so. She said nothing in response to the attention. She had a great deal of work to do, and very little time for conversations that were not moving things forward. The formal vote to invite Earth back to the Interstellar Council was called in the early weeks of the 3rd year. It was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. What was a surprise was the margin. 31 in favor, 11 against. 3 years earlier, the expulsion had passed 38-4. The shift was significant. The 11 remaining votes against were almost entirely the Vorath hardliners, and even among them, 2 had abstained rather than voted no, which was as close as that faction was likely to come to changing sides. The transmission was prepared, encoded, and routed through the Council's priority communication network to Earth's diplomatic office. From there, it was forwarded to Nathan Cole, who was no longer standing in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Interstellar Council. He was aboard a deep space survey vessel called the Resolute, which was currently running a mapping operation in a previously uncharted star cluster about 9 light-years from the nearest Council boundary marker. He was there because, after 3 years of building and managing and negotiating and watching the galaxy slowly rearrange itself, he had asked for 2 weeks of something quieter. His superiors had given him a month and a survey assignment. He was standing at the main viewport when his communications officer brought him the transmission. The officer, a serious young man from Georgia named Pete Dolan, who had been with Nathan for 2 years and had learned to deliver things calmly no matter what they contained, handed over the datapad without comment and stepped back to give Nathan space to read. He read it again. Then he set the datapad on the console beside the viewport and looked out at the stars. The cluster they were mapping was young by stellar standards, full of hot blue-white stars that burned with a kind of urgency, as if they had something to prove. He had been watching them for 3 days and was not tired of them yet. His young assistant, Mia Reyes, appeared at the viewport beside him. She was 26, originally from New Mexico, and had the quick, direct quality of someone who had grown up in a place where the sky was very large and there had been a lot of time to think under it. She had read the transmission over Pete's shoulder before it reached Nathan, because she read everything, and she was not the kind of person who pretended she hadn't. "So," she said, Are we going back? Nathan thought about it. He thought about the Grand Assembly Hall and the cold blue numbers on the voting screen. He thought about Dana Okafor's small smile at the exit door, which he had understood completely, even at the time. Because Dana knew, and he knew, what that room had just set in motion. He thought about Owen Briggs's sticky note in the maintenance corridor. He thought about Connor Marsh and synthetic tubing and a downloaded reference guide. He thought about Carl Deming's table and Lisa Tran's food stall and a small girl on a concourse holding out a piece of fruit to the most powerful diplomat in Vorath politics. He picked up his pen. He was one of the last diplomats of his generation who still wrote with a physical pen on a physical notepad when he was thinking. He opened the notepad and began to write. What he wrote was not an acceptance. It was not a refusal either. It was a counterproposal. 12 pages long, plain spoken, with no rhetorical ornamentation and no implied threats. It said, in clear and direct language, that Earth was willing to return to the Interstellar Council. It also said that Earth's return came with conditions, not punitive conditions, not the kind of conditions designed to humiliate the Council or reverse old injuries. Practical ones, real ones. Every species currently in Earth's bilateral network would be offered full Council membership, with simplified entry requirements and no political sponsor needed. The movement restrictions that the Council had placed on the Marathi nomads 4 decades ago, restrictions that had been written into the charter by a committee that had never actually met a Marathi, would be lifted immediately. Freeport Station would be recognized as neutral sovereign territory, not affiliated with any single species, open to all, governed by the people who lived and worked there. And the Council's voting structure would be reviewed within 2 years, with the goal of giving smaller civilizations, the ones the Council had always treated as minor, a meaningful voice in decisions that affected them. Nathan wrote for 2 hours. When he was done, he read the whole thing through once, changed 4 words, and handed it to Pete Dolan for encoding. Priority channel, Nathan said. Full Council distribution. Pete nodded and left. Nathan turned back to the viewport. Mia was still there, leaning against the frame, looking at the young stars. 12 pages, she said. I'm guessing that's not just a yes. It's a yes, Nathan said. It's just a yes with terms. The transmission reached the Grand Assembly Hall during a general session that happened to be in progress. A routine agenda meeting, the kind where very little was decided and a great deal was discussed. The Council's Chief Secretary received it, scanned the cover notation, and interrupted the session. He read the transmission aloud to the full chamber, which was unusual enough that the room fell completely silent from the first sentence, and stayed that way through all 12 pages. When the reading was done, the chamber remained quiet for a long time. Not the uncomfortable silence of shock, and not the restless silence of disagreement. Something in between, the silence of a room full of very intelligent beings, absorbing something they had not fully expected, and finding, upon reflection, that they could not reasonably object to it. The eldest delegate in the chamber was Vor Us of the Theshari Federation, who was somewhere beyond 5 centuries old, and had the slightly transparent quality of very ancient Theshari skin, as if time had made him more light than solid. He had said very little at recent sessions. When he spoke now, the chamber stayed quiet to listen. 3 years ago, Voras said, in the slow and careful way of someone choosing each word as if from a limited supply, we removed them from this council because we were afraid of what they might become. It seems we were right to be afraid. We simply had no idea what form that becoming would take. He paused. He looked around the room, at the 42 banners, at the 42 species whose entire understanding of the galaxy had shifted in 3 years, because of what one civilization had done when given nothing but open space and its own habits. They did not fight us, he said. They did not build weapons or armies. They went out into the parts of this galaxy that we had decided did not matter, and they made friends. And somehow, he paused again, And in the pause was something that might have been wonder, or might have been the closest a 500-year-old alien diplomat could come to admitting he had been genuinely surprised. Somehow, that was enough. The vote to accept Earth's counterproposal passed the following week, 30-13. The 13 were not all Vorath hardliners. Some of them were species that had legitimate concerns about the new membership framework, concerns that Nathan's team addressed in direct bilateral conversations over the following month, one by one, patiently, the way humanity seemed to address most things. Back aboard the Resolute, Nathan received the confirmation of acceptance on his datapad, while standing at the same viewport. The young blue stars were still burning in the cluster ahead. His survey team had mapped 70% of it. There were systems in the remaining 30% that sensors had flagged for closer examination. Unusual readings, promising signatures, the kind of data that suggested something worth investigating. He noted the largest flag system on his map. He gave it no name. He just added a small notation in the margin of the survey log, in the same plain handwriting he used for everything. Worth a closer look. Then he put the datapad down, looked out at the stars for one more quiet moment, and went back to work.